Thank you, Tony, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me as part of this panel. I'm neither a housing practitioner nor a policy maker, but rather, as you've heard, an economist who looks on housing as an important part of Australia's economy and of our social system and meeting important needs. But nonetheless, my view is very much of a top-down one rather than a bottom-up one. And as those of you who looked at the agenda will know, I'm going to be talking shortly in more detail about some of those aspects of the economy and the housing system that I do think are particularly important. And what I have been asked to say here and intend to do is a potted version of some of the things that I'll be talking about in more detail in an hour or so's time. We have been through a period where housing prices have escalated significantly over the last 4 or 5 years in response to what has become for Australia a period of record low interest rates. It appears that that period of rapidly rising prices is now drawing to a close in those areas of Australia, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, where prices have risen a lot. They now seem to be levelling out, and in some smaller areas there are even reports of decline. I think there is no law of gravity that applies to house prices, that simply because they have gone up a lot doesn't necessarily mean that at some point they are bound to come down, as they did in places like the US, Ireland or Spain. But nonetheless, policy measures do appear to have played some role in drawing that period of rapid price increases to an end, and I'll refer to a couple of those in just a moment. We've also had, beginning more recently, a period of rapid growth in housing supply. Last year, 2015, was the first year in Australia's history where more than 200,000 new dwellings were commenced, and it's likely, notwithstanding that building approvals by local governments have peaked late last year and are now declining somewhat, that 2016 will also see another 200,000 plus dwellings commenced. And it's perhaps worth noting that foreign investors have played a very significant role in the upswing over the last 2 years in the number of new dwellings commenced, whilst domestic investors have played an almost entirely insignificant role in that increase in new dwelling supply. There's also a question, of course, about the diversity of that new housing supply, and in particular whether the large share of new dwelling commencements being originated by foreign investors meet the kind of demand that there's likely to be for housing from Australian residents over the longer term. Third, that period of rising prices over the last 4 years, coming after what's been more than 2 decades of generally upward pressure on house prices, has led to a significant deterioration in housing affordability, which, when you consider that the last 25 years have seen interest rates roughly half what they were over the previous 20 years, and during which governments have spent billions of dollars through first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions and the like, ostensibly on programs designed, so they say, to make housing more affordable, that is nonetheless quite a remarkable result. It's encapsulated by the observation that the home ownership rate at the 2011 census was the lowest that had been at any census since 1954. That's not to say it's down to the 1954 level, but it's nonetheless lower than at any other census since then. More importantly, in my view, is that the home ownership rate among people aged between 25 and 55, which includes the traditional first home and in some cases second home by a group, the home ownership rate among them has declined by an average of 9 percentage points between the 1991 and 2011 censuses. And the only reason that that isn't reflected in a decline in the overall home ownership rate is because of the offsetting effect on the overall home ownership rate of the significant increase in the proportion of the population living in households headed by people aged 55 and over, where, for obvious reasons, the home ownership rate is a lot higher than that among people of younger ages. You might ask in this audience, why does that matter? why should you be concerned at such a significant decline in the rate of home ownership? And I'd suggest that there are at least three reasons why that ought to be of concern for you. One is, given the significant difference in the wealth experience of those who own property and those who don't, the fall in home ownership rates, combined with a very significant increase in the prices of property in Australia, has probably been one of the biggest single drivers of the increase in inequality in the distribution of wealth over the last 25 years. Second, it remains the case that Australia's retirement income system still has as an unstated but important assumption that the vast majority of people over the age of 65 will have very low housing costs because they own their own homes outright, free of mortgage. And as that diminishingly becomes the case, it puts additional pressure on Australia's retirement income systems. And third, and perhaps most importantly for those of you in this room, the decline in home ownership among people who in previous generations would have been in homeowners means that there are now more people of moderate but not low incomes who are in the rental market looking for rental housing and are competing with those who otherwise wouldn't have faced competition from people more affluent than themselves, and it's been a significant factor driving up rents in the private rental market. And so I think there's a direct link between the rise in house prices, the decline in home ownership rates among people aged between 25 and 55, and statistics on the rising proportion of low-income households who are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, from 35% in 2007-08 to 44% in 2013-14, or in the proportion of low-income households' income that goes on housing costs from 28% to 34.5% over the same period. In other words, the rise in house prices, while it may in the first instance appear to adversely affect those who want to buy their own homes, also has very important spillover effects on those who are unable to buy their own homes and are required to seek accommodation in the rental market. What's to be done about that? Well, as foreshadowed, I'll say more about that in the next session, but in broad terms I think there are four things that ought to be on the agenda of all governments, and I very much recognise Ian's point that this is a multi-jurisdictional problem in which no level of government can ever be expected to have all of the answers. The first broad thing in my view is that government should stop doing things that inflate the demand for housing. And we have seen some progress on that score over the last 4 years. In particular, I welcome the fact that every state and territory government in the country has, over the last 4 years, stopped giving first homeowner grants to people who purchase established housing in favour of increasing grants to people who purchase new housing. Now, there's no guarantee that that will, as its proponents advocate, result in an increase in the supply of housing. It is possible that those increased grants will simply go into inflating builders' profit margins, but at least it removes an important source of upward pressure on the price of existing dwellings, and that's a very wise decision. Second, although I don't want to overstate the importance of this, the actions of the federal government in tightening up and enhancing the FIRB's capacity to monitor compliance with regulations designed to prevent foreign investors from inflating the price of established housing is by and large a welcome development. Likewise, the actions of APRA, the prudential regulator of the banking system, requiring banks to tighten up their lending criteria for lending to investors, over 90% of whom buy established dwellings, is also a welcome development in removing what had been perhaps the most important source of upward pressure on the prices of established dwellings over the last 4 or 5 years. I want to emphasise, therefore, that over the last 3 years, federal and state governments, most of them coalition governments, have taken actions that have dampened upward pressure on prices, in particular that pressure that's come from investors seeking to buy established housing. Which brings me to the final area that, in my view, calls for action in terms of government stopping doing things that inflate the demand for housing, which is of course to remove the very significant biases that the tax system imparts to investment in housing. And while I've got reservations about two significant aspects of the policy that the Labor Party has put forward for consideration at the next election, I certainly think what Chris Bowen has advocated with regard to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount represent a significant improvement over what the tax system currently imparts towards biases regarding investment in established housing. And I think much of what's been said both by the government and by the property industry regarding the alleged effects of that are simply not founded on evidence and represent the kind of scare campaign that we last saw prompted by the mining industry against the resources rent tax. So the first thing, as I say, that should be on the agenda here is to continue the process of stopping doing things that serve only to inflate the demand for housing. The second thing I think that should be on the agenda is that government should think twice about pursuing more regulations that increase the cost of new housing. I understand, as well as anybody else, the thinking behind measures that are designed, for example, to improve the energy efficiency of new homes or to enhance safety features. But it seems to me that insufficient consideration has been given while pursuing those worthwhile objectives to the almost inevitable impact those measures have on inflating the cost of new housing, which usually gets passed in a supply-constrained market onto the ultimate buyer. Third, in my view, government should be trying to stop doing things that constrain the supply of housing. And this is primarily a state and local government issue, but it goes to the way in which planning and zoning laws can be used and have been used to inhibit greenfields development on the fringes of our urban cities and, more importantly, higher density residential development in inner suburban areas that are much better serviced by transport and are much closer to jobs and entertainment. And in my view, it's that factor, the impact of state and local government planning laws, particularly in Sydney, which explain a very high proportion of the increase in prices in inner cities. Fourth, governments need to start doing more of things that will increase the supply of housing, especially that of affordable housing. And I endorse the observation that Ian made in his presentation that it's not really now a question of exploring new models. The answers are broadly well known. It's deciding which of those answers we want to pursue and putting the financial and other resources of governments and the business sector and investors behind those. It's worth noting that according to figures compiled by the Productivity Commission, over the last 12 years, the supply of what I'll call mainstream social housing, that is public and community housing, has increased from 374,000 to 394,000. That's just 20,000 units, or 5%. The Australian population increases by 5% every 2.5 years on average over that sort of period. So there's a variety of things that can be done under that heading, some of which I'll say more about in my session, and I'm sure will be a feature of most of the conversations that are held over the course of the next day and a half. I hope that's provided some context for your discussions, and I look forward to hearing the rest of this discussion. Thank you.